All right, now that the awkward part is over, welcome to Zero to Traction, a podcast about how first-time founders create companies that scale. I'm one of your regular co-hosts, JDM, aka Josh David Miller, here with my other regular co-host, Cameron Law. Cameron, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Always great to be back in the studio with you and looking forward to our awesome discussion today.
Yeah, and we got a little something special here because Cameron and I have been saying for a while that we were going to go back to bringing on our friends, which has always been like part of the description of the show that it's us and our friends. And we've been friendless for a while. I don't know what we did, but it happened, and we've been solo for a little while. But we were able, through deceit and trickery and cunning and guile, convince Brooke Borseth to join us today. So, Brooke, welcome to Zero to Traction.
Oh, wow. Thanks for having me. I am so honored to be counted amongst your friends.
we have,
So,
we have
so
a
Brooke,
short list, so you're in good company.
so Brooke, tell us a fun fact about yourself.
Ooh, a fun fact. I used to be obsessed with Rubik's cubes when I was a kid. I used to bring them into classes. So on like the traditional Rubik's cubes, they have on their website. So one time I think I was on like a family road trip and they had Rubik's.com, I think is like what's on the website. So I looked it up and it teaches you on the website how to solve it. So I learned how to solve Rubik's cubes, and then I was that annoying kid for most of middle and high school that like had a Rubik's cube in their backpack, and when things were kind of boring in a class, I would solve Rubik's cubes. And so for years people would gift me like bigger and bigger and odder Rubik's cubes, and at some point they just got too big and I didn't have the patience for it. But I think my best time was like 1 second over a minute, and I was really disappointed to not have broken that.
Oh, that's that fine line. You just went right over it. But I
Yep,
didn't. Okay, so
yep.
one thing I have to follow up on there is you said odd, like odd Rubik's Cube. What makes a Rubik's Cube odd?
Oh, there's a few things. One, you can get bigger, right? So you can, the traditional is 3 by 3 by 3, right? So you can
Yeah.
increase that into, I think the biggest one I had was 7 by 7 by 7, which they tend to get expensive and they also break pretty easily when you have that many components moving. But you can also get odd in that they either have pictures on them, so they're not like the traditional images. I have one that is no colors, but all the different like 3 by 3s are different sizes. So each block is kind of unique size. So it looks really funky when you're like messing it up, but it's really satisfying when it comes back together. I also have some that are different shapes, so not like cubes, but you can have like pyramid shapes, or you can have like, I don't even know, maybe what's the like 20-sided dice type thing. Like I've had one of those as well in a Rubik's cube form, and those are really really hard. So I'm definitely not above cheating. I look things up to learn how to do them, and that's kind of the fun part for me. But it's been like 10 years since I've learned how to do a new Rubik's cube.
So why is your Zoom background not just a bunch of comically large and hilariously misshapen Rubik's cubes?
Oh my
Rubik's
gosh. The
cubes.
most embarrassing thing I think I've ever done with a Rubik's Cube, this is like pretty pretentious, but in high school, anyone in Washington, they don't do like weighted GPA. So anyone that had a 4.0 in my high school, and there were like 10 of us, was a valedictorian, and they let us all give speeches at graduation. So there were like 10 speeches back to back. And so I brought up a Rubik's Cube onto the stage and like made this metaphor about, I don't even know what, about moving on to the next stage of your life and putting pieces in place as I was like solving a Rubik's cube, and that was my valedictorian speech, which in retrospect was like quite the flex, and maybe not my best move.
I think like just your shtick should be whenever you're like part of a panel discussion, you never mention it or anything. But while you're just
Just
sitting there
pull it
on
out.
stage, you just pull out a Rubik's cube and you just start doing that whenever you're not talking, and just see if it becomes part of the. It's like I always wear the brightly colored shoes, and like people end up knowing me as the guy in the brightly colored shoes. Brooke, you could be the person with the Rubik's cube.
Oh my gosh. Secretly, I do still have one of those like odd monochromatic Rubik's cubes at my desk here at Moneta. And sometimes, especially during team meetings, I have a tendency to speak, I think, a little too much. And so if I'm trying to remind myself to just sit and listen, I'll like by myself play with that Rubik's cube, because you can do it by feel and not by looking at it. So that's more of the tendency, is to remind myself not to talk rather than the other way around.
So your desk at Moneta is a great segue into. So you're an associate at Moneta Ventures. Tell us what that means, and what does Moneta Ventures invest in?
Yeah, so Moneta broadly is an early stage venture capital investor. So originally founded by a group of folks who have started and sold a couple businesses out of Sacramento, out of Folsom specifically. We invest broadly along the West Coast and in Texas in seed and Series A technology companies. So for us, we're pretty generalist investors, industry agnostic. For us, we define seed as 500K and up type companies. Series A, there's a little bit of flex there. I'd say for most companies now, it's somewhere between like $1.5 to $3 million in revenue at the Series A stage. And then as an associate, I screen deals kind of all day long. I'm the first line of defense in some senses to look at companies, make sure that they're broadly within our thesis. And then if there's interest there on both sides to continue a discussion around, an equity investment, I'll run through the process with a partner and taking them all the way to investment committee. There's usually creation of a big long deal memo, which is kind of like a written, paper describing the company and the opportunity. And then if, a term sheet is offered and accepted, I'll run through a due diligence process as well. So that's kind of like the, assurance piece of it. Were the assumptions that we made the investments on accurate? And then making sure too that we're getting to know the company, even better than we did before, so that we can be better, coaches and partners down the road. And then, post investment, I try and be helpful in whatever way I can. So that's kind of my role at Moneta. Personally, I've been there for 3 years. I've sat in our Sacramento office the whole time and have gotten to know the ecosystem here pretty well over that time period. So it's been fun to learn the industry kind of by doing, and then also to get to know Sacramento pretty well.
All right, awesome. Well, we're always happy to have you involved in various ecosystem programs. You are super involved in all that stuff, which, of course, we and all of our founders appreciate. So we decided for this particular episode, since you have this investment gatekeeping, we'll say it politely, function there. That's the politest way I can think of.
That is a kind way.
Yeah, to say what you do. So we've brought you here onto the show for an episode we are calling the Investor Relations Tightrope edition of the Zero to Traction podcast. Got a lot of fun stuff that we figured we'd talk about. But Cameron, why don't you kick us off? Take us out, 30,000 foot view, frame the discussion for us here.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Brooke, for joining us. We're excited to have you in the studio. And as we're looking at one, supporting first time founders that are looking to scale and raise capital, we often see a lot of the discussion and feedback that they get is around like the pitch and the pitch deck. And we in this podcast really want to like peel back that onion of like what is actually being shared when you're getting feedback around, say, a particular element of your pitch deck, or just even in the screening process, I know, or the gatekeeping, however you want to frame it here in this discussion. The feedback that's often sometimes provided isn't always what the founders like ultimately going to be taking steps to work on. And so would love to, dive in for our discussion of like this tightrope that we were talking about around fundraising, and some of the things that we were, chatting about is just some of the things that we see people pitch or present that are immediate flags, or ultimately kind of turn off the investor or the other side of the table. And so would love to just hear what are a couple of those initial things that come to mind when you're hearing a pitch. Or I think actually one thing I also wanted to share, and we've talked about this I think a few episodes ago, was we often think that the first touch point with a fund or an investor is like standing with your pitch deck and doing a pitch with it, or often it might just be like meeting for a coffee or something of that sort. And so would love to hear a little bit more about kind of like what are those initial touch points that you have with founders, and kind of like what's that first step that you're ultimately engaging them with, and kind of like where they would go from there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a few ways that we meet companies, right? And I would say that the path to, through an investment process kind of varies depending on the way that you meet a company. A large portion of Moneta's deal flow is actually inbound. So we have, a wide network of LPs and kind of general professional colleagues that will, run across companies or meet companies, or their friends or family start companies. And we like to be one of the first calls to get introduced to companies. Whether or not they're the right stage for us at that point, varies a lot, right? So a lot of times if it's somebody who just started a company, it's way too early for us. They maybe are just kind of working on an MVP, don't have any type of customers, pilots, agreements, like anything like that. Too early for us, right? But we'll still take that call and be a resource to them. A lot of times, I think of venture capital as a game. I think that there's something to be said about, the fundamentals of your business for sure, but there's also kind of a common language in how you approach investors and what it really looks like to go out and raise multiple series of institutional capital, right? So a lot of times we'll do coaching as far as like how the game is played is how I like to think about it, while people are still working on like the fundamentals of the business, and it might be a stage too early for us. But if they are at the right stage, then we can run them through the whole investment process. And that's usually a series of Zoom calls. So I would say most of the time, if it's a cold intro to me, from somebody that I haven't met before, it's like a 30-minute call with just me, right? And the idea is like, tell me at a high level what the idea is, where your business is at, does it meet our thesis, right? So there's a few things that Moneta is like always screening for, right? And most of the time I'm looking to say no, right? I'm not looking to say yes in this first call. I'm looking to say no. And that's just a part of the job, really. I'm looking to be helpful. And if I should say no, right? And so I'm saying no if, they're pre-product, if they're pre-revenue for the most part, if there's like other like weird situations that just make it not a venture backable idea, or there's some corporate history that makes it tricky, I'm looking to screen those out just to save everybody some time. And then I'm also looking to be helpful, right? So if there's some education that I can do, or there's connections that I can make, I'll also look to do that, right? But for those cold meetings, it's usually like a 30-minute call where I'm just looking to kind of get like the facts of the business. A lot of times I'll meet folks in person, right? So I'm, very active in all these Sacramento events, like you said. I see you guys all the time. Usually around 5:30, there's some sort of event. A lot of nights out of the week, and I'm meeting companies. A lot of times I find that companies I'm meeting at events are also a stage too early, so there's more of a relationship building phase there than I would have with a cold intro meeting from somebody in our broader network. So a lot of times it's like, hey, great to meet you. Give me the 10-second on your idea, because it's at some sort of like networking deal, or it's before some sort of panel or something that we're listening to. And a lot of times that's about like all the time I get, right? I get their 10-second elevator pitch. I say, hey, that sounds generally within the realm of like B2B software. I know nothing about the stage. I know nothing about the team's background. And so I say like, hey, I'm local, would love to grab coffee sometime, right? Like that's kind of the deal. And so I meet over coffee, get like a broader sense of their story, but it's not like a pitch in the sense that I think a lot of people are coached to design pitches, especially for these like 5-minute pitch competitions. It's a lot more like holistic view on that person's background, where they think they're going, why they're interested in the space. And then I also do kind of get like the facts of the case, so to speak, about like, hey, like, where are you in the stage of things? Have you raised money before? Like, what's the plan to kind of get from 0 to 1? But it's not like a formal, this is your one shot, pitch me and then, I'll make a decision. Like it's a lot more about relationship building, especially for those local companies, which I think is kind of a benefit, right? There's been a number of times where we've met companies, a couple years before they're really to that like seed series A stage. And it's nice to be able to get a sense of like, hey, does this company deliver on what they say they're going to deliver? Can you trust their projections? Do they hold up in the ecosystem, right? Like, do they do right by their people and their employees and other people in the ecosystem? I think all of that stuff goes into your interest in a company. And it's so much broader than just the pitch, right? Like the pitch is a part of that discussion, but in that slower getting to know you phase, you get a lot broader sense of the team. And that is honestly one of the things that investors scrutinize most heavily, especially at the earliest stages. So it's always nice as an early stage investor to feel like you have some runway to really get comfortable with that person.
So I think that's a great overview of that, or the early touch points in the process. I think it's great. I think there's 3 things that we were talking about before we hit record that I think might be great to hit on. So maybe I'll throw out some structure for the rest of this. So like the first thing is like this idea that you were just hitting on, Brooke, of like pitch versus presentation, right? And those are not the same thing. And like most programs that teach people how to pitch are really teaching them how to present in a particular context and a particular idiom, which is interesting. And I actually would love to like wrap on that for a bit, and while doing my best to avoid it devolving into another JDM rant. And then the second thing is we had talked about some of the pet peeves, like the things that founders don't know that people who hear pitches for a living don't want to hear, and then an alarming number of them commit at least one of these sins. So perhaps we could talk about some pitch sins. And then third, I think we could talk about some of the investor relations components of this, about how you go about building those relationships and establishing trust. And we alluded in the title to this tightrope that you have to walk. So I'll just tease that tightrope, and then we'll come back to that. So maybe start with like pitch versus presentation, which I'll just ask this way. So, and this is a question to both of you. If you could make this more like Shark Tank, would you?
This as in like the whole industry,
your job,
how capital is allocated.
Yeah, your job. If you could just be like, I forget her name, who is Barbara, whatever, Mr. Wonderful, or something like that. If you could just don that role,
like this is your shot and you're out.
Yeah.
I mean, the gut response is no, right? There's plenty of things that you're not going to discover in a pitch, that are relevant to your investment decision. But at the same time, like I'd like to qualify that, because I do think that there is some sense of savviness that comes from being able to pitch well, right? Like I said earlier, I called venture capital a game, and I really do think of it that way. Like I think that if you understand the game, it's going to help you a lot in your future fundraising efforts. And it also shows that you're kind of a quick study, and you can figure out like how things work when they're not implicitly or, explicitly taught all the time. Right. So, so no is the answer that I truly believe. Right. But part of me also says yes. Right. Because it is, I think, somewhat correlated between those companies who give kind of great venture style pitches, and also CEOs who can inspire people with a vision, and people who are kind of quick studies of what I like to call the game.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think a big part for me is the process of going through actual presenting in this, like on a stage with a microphone. You have a set time plus Q&A. I think for me, like the biggest value in that is learning to articulate the core concepts of the business really clearly. And that is not something that you can ever do just by practice by yourself. Like you can't go into your bathroom mirror and just like practice your pitch over and over again and expect it to be good, right? Because it's a question of like, does this language land with this particular audience? And you probably have more than one audience, but I won't go there. But like, is that message landing, and can I get these concepts like established really clearly? And the format of saying like, I have this set amount of time to do that, and then I'm going to get Q&A gives you the perfect opportunity to say, are the questions about things that I was clearly not clear about? And so therefore my message didn't land. Or is it more about, oh, that's interesting, tell me more? Because those are two very different responses to a pitch. For me, I see that as like the biggest value, even though I think there's an accidental disservice that I'm including myself here, but like that we do when we run these programs, because we mix the two together and end up conflating pitch and presentation, saying like, when you go talk to investors, you're going to go do this. And so like, I'm curious, do you ever get the people like that you have coffee with who like turn their laptop around towards you and try to go through the whole pitch like that?
I have never had that happen, right? Especially not a 5-minute pitch, right? But it just doesn't work. I inevitably will interrupt people and ask questions, and you kind of like knock somebody out of their pitch flow. But if you're having a kind of casual conversation like that, it's unnatural to speak in those terms. I will say that we do introduce like a more formal type pitch in our investment process, specifically at the end. So, and it's more of like a 20-minute type pitch, right? So there's this process where you go through, I'm your initial screen, you work with a partner and me to kind of get to know your business thoroughly. And then me and that partner put together kind of a comprehensive memo, send it out to our team. And then, assuming that everybody's still excited about the opportunity, you formally pitch the team. So we do introduce that like kind of storytelling aspect back into our evaluation process, but it's at the end more so. And it's meant, I think, to judge kind of your visionary abilities and your ability to kind of like sell the story, So, but no, we don't just listen to 5-minute pitches. I've never listened to a 5-minute pitch in a real context. And it's also usually not the case that somebody's running me through like even like their, problem story, meet Jill this, right? Which I coach people to do in these 5-minute pitches, but that doesn't work most of the time. It doesn't translate as well when you're having a one-on-one interaction as opposed to a presentation to a large room of people.
Well, Cameron and I have had somebody turn their laptop around and give us that pitch in person.
What was
So
the
I wonder,
impression?
I, I wonder if that's a matter of like stage, right? I feel like if you're later in the process, you might have a better understanding of the like model, and you know, if you're pitching and you already have 500,000 in revenue, you've hopefully already served a lot of,
Yeah.
you know, Jills at that stage, that where that story is less resonant than like a growth strategy than like the early stage founder who's maybe trying to figure out like, is this actually the right problem? I'm still not like advocating that you should turn
Yeah.
around a you know, computer and kind of go through that story, but there is sometimes that component of things. When we were talking about Shark Tank, I'm definitely like a no. But what is interesting to me is like what we see is the 3 minute like pitch on Shark Tank, but that's really like an hour's worth of recording, right? And so it's we're
it's
saying yes,
produced.
no, don't do Shark Tank, but it's also like that was an hour-long grill session that founder went through, and there's
Yeah.
ultimately we're seeing the high level, you know, discussion and you know the initial pitch to get it started. So it would be interesting to like see the full session that they had. I think that would be more real, and that they don't have a pitch deck, right? They're talking about the product and kind of in a showcase fashion. So I think there's some interest in that, but I do wonder if that's kind of what catalyzed more of the pitch competition style of, you know, stand up, do the thing.
Yeah, I think it's a necessary evil when you're trying to go through like 15 companies in an hour and a half that people are willing to sit and listen to it. You know, I understand how you get to those short pitches, right? But I also do think that there's value for a founder in having to create these short forms. I don't think that necessarily if you have a great pitch, it's going to equate to a great company. But I do think that it forces you to kind of sit down and think like, what's the fundamental like story behind this business? Like, why do I believe that this is like a company that's going to take off and be a great investment? I think a lot of times, especially at the earliest stages, you'll see founders who are technical or product minded, and they will build a company and they build a product, sorry, and then they build a company around it, right? And so a lot of times it's not until they get into these pitch scenarios where they have to think about the broader picture of like, is this company a good business? Not just, is this product something that I would like to have? And so I do think that there's a lot of value to that. And there's even, I think, sometimes you see later stage companies struggle with this as well. They come out with a very product focused deck, and it's not that's just not going to work, I think, past especially a seed stage. Like for a Series A company, you have to have a very compelling vision about why this approach makes sense for this category and why that category itself, you know, is going to be a compelling investment opportunity.
Yeah, and I think to Cameron, your point earlier, that when you're in the earlier stages, you can't point to metrics and a track record that exist independently. Like you can say, oh, you know, this summer, you know, we double tripled, and like this is how we're looking. This is great. You can't point to any of that, and that doesn't mean that there aren't metrics that matter that you can and should talk about, but they're not going to be independently compelling the way sales are. They're going to require a narrative and context, and so all you can really do is paint a vision and say why these are leading indicators toward that vision, which means you have to rely much more on some of those narrative structures. But that's where, like, for me at least, there's a distinction between the kinds of things that work well in a on stage, we'll just say, that also work well at the coffee shop. And we can separate those from those that work well only on stage. And there's also some things that only work well in the coffee shop, and they're all important. But like one example is, like you said, oh, meet Jill. You know, Jill does this. That actually works pretty well on stage. It doesn't work well at a coffee shop, but that doesn't mean that the storytelling structure doesn't, right? And so, like, if what you're trying to grind in is this like concept of there's a market with a severe and urgent pain, and there's a lot of people out there, you wouldn't say meet Jill if for no other reason you're not showing a photo of Jill right now, and that's just odd. But you could say that, like, you know, the average so and so in this particular industry, they try, right? And like talking about, because what you're really doing is painting a picture of the problem, and that also works on stage. So I think that, like, just as if I could be critical of our industry for a little bit, and in this more Cameron's in mine than yours, although you play your role, you are not absolved of guilt. Um, is you know, like, if we, the more that we can tell people to or help people not do the things that only work on stage, as if that's an important part of their pitch, like, one that actually immediately comes to mind to me is call and response, which is actually a pet peeve of mine. When somebody starts a pitch with, how many of you out there have ever, like, first of all, it's dumb, because the chances of that actually working when you have 3 or 4 people that you're talking to that probably aren't your customers it's probably not going to work. And like, it doesn't matter. They're like, because the investors aren't looking for a product to buy. They're looking for a company to invest in. Like, those two very different things. So like, stuff like that we can just kind of take out of the repertoire and say, like, that just doesn't make sense. I said I wouldn't turn it into a rant, but it was going to happen.
Well, should we pivot then to the rant that maybe inspired the idea of this episode?
Yeah, let's do
with
it.
pitch pet peeves. Okay. So the one that I mentioned first was, if I had a nickel for every time that a founder has been going through their pitch and has gotten to their financial slide and just told me, but these are extremely conservative, I would probably more than outstrip my salary, Moneta. So it's just something that you hear every time, no matter how sophisticated or unsophisticated the founder and the financial team is. It's like you could just put money on it. It's actually kind of hilarious, but it is a pet peeve. And we were talking earlier, right? And why does it annoy me? I think that's something that I have to insert in here if I'm going to bring it up, right? But I understand that you think it's conservative, right? But the reason why I chuckle to myself is because I see these financials missed left and right every day, right? Like, I would say I feel like probably less than 5% of the financials that I'm pitched meet their next 12 months milestone, right? Like, it's not, forget year 5, right? That shows your like insane revenue growth. We're talking like next 12 months. It's just no matter how conservative you feel it is, I see it missed more often than not, right? So one, I don't believe you out of past experience. And then 2, it's like, well, shouldn't that be kind of the norm, right? Like, do you have to add that in there? And it is the norm, right? Because I hear it all the time. Like, you should approach it with conservatism. Like, I think that the more mature thing to do is to explain like the assumptions that go into it, rather than just to tell me that it's conservative and let me trust your opinion, which from my past experience has been wrong, right? Like, to founders generally. So that's why it's a pet peeve of mine, right? But there's a whole list of other, we'll call them like pitch sins, that a lot of times will kind of set investors, minds just a little bit tilted away from building trust. I think JDM used that word earlier, right? If we're looking to build trust, there's a few of these like pitfalls that you may be stepping into without knowing it.
The conservative thing, like that word, like, I mean, I hear it every time and it doesn't land well with me. It doesn't bother me as much as I think the reliance on the metric that everybody already knows is wrong. And like, I'm almost a little bit offended when I hear that, because like, I know it's bullshit, but you don't seem to know that I know it's bullshit. So what are you saying about me? And it's like, because we all know the numbers are wrong. Everybody knows the numbers are wrong. Investors aren't counting on the numbers being right. Like, that's not the point. And we're looking for something directionally accurate that we can say like, well, it's over there. And like, this is something that we can, through the work of entrepreneurship, like turn into something amazing. And that's great. And like, particularly if you're in the earlier stages, like if you're, raising, pre-seed or seed, there's probably something more interesting to focus on as far as like where we're going to be in 6 months than the pure financials. Not to say the financials aren't important, because they are, and you do have to draw that picture, but like that there's something a bit more interesting about what we're going to accomplish, and saying that we're not talking about that at all is also leading me to believe that somebody's chasing a mirage, right? That they're just going to focus on these, at my $10 a month SaaS, with 4 customers, I'm gonna track that metric. It's gonna be awesome.
Brooke, is part of it, and I totally agree with the conversation, but I guess one of the thoughts is like, is it that they're relying on the methodology being conservative versus demonstrating what the methodology to derive that number, and the assumptions behind it, versus like, I just picked this number, it's conservative, that's my methodology, so I didn't actually do the work to like build that whole assumption map around it, versus, here's my methodology, you can then therefore derive if you think that that's conservative or not. And so it's, I guess maybe a way that now I'm like articulating it is like, it's kind of a sense of laziness in the way that you're just saying, oh, this is just a conservative number, we'll beat it, even though from track records that that's not very likely.
Yeah, I guess the things that I think that would reassure me more than someone telling me that their like projections are conservative are for them either to point to some of those other metrics that are drivers, right? JDM, like, hey, tell me like how many pipeline conversations that you have in, price negotiation plus, right? Like tell me the dollars that are going to lead to there. Tell me what your conversion rate has been historically. Help me understand the other things that are going to support you actually hitting that number rather than you just telling me that you think it's conservative, right? Because I do think it especially rubs me the wrong way when I feel like that is missing, right? Especially if it's, hey, we're about to turn a quarter, but don't worry, these projections are conservative. I'm like, well, that's based on a set of assumptions that you really haven't proven out to yourself or to me, right? So help me understand the assumptions more so than just saying it's conservative.
That's seems really similar to the 1% problem, where they
Yeah.
have some massive TAM and they say, well, if we only get 1% of this, then everything's amazing.
Right. And it's just an oversimplification saying, like, well, you should know how hard it is to get just 1%, right? And it's like, I've seen it in our portfolio. Like, if anyone has 1% of the market, that's a phenomenal outcome, right? But that's a very hard thing to achieve. And so I think it points to kind of the naivete on the part of the founder to say, like, well, it shouldn't be that hard, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
What? Go ahead.
What are some other like sins, right? I think those are some of the bigger ones. I think that one of the other things that I sometimes see, especially really early stage founders doing, is putting in valuations and things in the deck that really come from your investors and kind of um, self-ascribing to those, right? I think that also kind of shows that you don't understand like the dynamics of the game, and is overcomable, right? If you're very coachable. But like if somebody I think is very kind of stuck in saying like, hey, well, we're raising, a priced round at a, $20 million valuation, that kind of shows me that you don't understand the rules of the game. And if you're, stuck with that, it also shows me that it's not going to be something that we can kind of work out of, right? If you need to learn the rules, that's something we can work with. But if you're like, this is the way it should be, and so this is the way it will be, I just don't think that that's going to work out for most investors who need you to play the game, down the road.
That's a good one. I think another pet peeve for me is, and I've just grown to actually really hate seeing Tam Sam Sam in a deck. Because it's almost never meaningful. It's all like I understand the concept and the value in the concept, but there's this 1% problem just sort of infects the obtainable market side of this. And so then there's two different problems for you. So like one is the TAM itself is often the TAM of the industry, which is not interesting at all. Like you're playing in that industry, but that's not addressable. Like it's what percentage of them have the particular problem that you're actually even trying to solve in the first place, right? And so we'll get these you're serving the restaurant business, and therefore your TAM is all restaurants. Like that's not like how much restaurants are making. Like no, they're not putting that money toward solving this problem. They're putting that money toward paying employees and like making food. Like that's what that goes to. So like that there's that's just I think just dumb and kind of pointless. But like I don't know, maybe your guys' experience is different, but when they start trying to break it like even a TAM that's reasonable down into a SAM and a SOM, that they're almost just completely worthless, and like I don't get why you would even draw it that way. Like why'd you break it down that way? And so like the best possible case that I ever see for those are where they break it geographically because they happen to have something like, oh, we're serving, college campuses. And so we can draw our obtainable market as these 3 college campuses or something like that. That's like the closest thing, but even that's not very interesting. I mean, I don't think,
Yeah.
because yeah.
What I find is valuable from those like Tam Sam Sam, charts is twofold, and then I have a question. So one, I think it shows that people know how to play the game, right? And there's some sense of like you have to include it because people expect it, right? And if you don't include it, people will question it. And so that's what my question is about. But my other point is that I think it is really helpful, specifically this chart, right, Tam Sam Sam, and showing me who you think your ICP is, right? It's your chance to define your ICP and also educate me as an investor, a generalist investor, on the dynamics of that market a little bit, right? So to me, I almost never pay attention to the numbers themselves, but I do pay attention to kind of how you segment it, right? And I do think that the better pitches are the ones that break it down and at least understand that they need to, have some sort of overall insight into the segment of the market that actually has that problem. I think it comes across to the negative if it's the industry as a whole. But I do think that, especially, I almost just look at the top and the bottom, right? Like, what's the SAM? Who do you think your specific ICP is? And then it should almost lead into your go-to-market. How do you think you're going to then go address those and win those? And do you have traction with that specific segment today? But my question to you guys more generally is, what do you think the right balance is, right? We're talking about this tightrope between, making meaningful charts, points, all that kind of stuff, making a pitch that gets across the point that you need it to, versus making the slides that people expect and are ready to consume information in, right? Playing the game versus giving what you think is the best way to portray that information.
Well, I love that. I mean, I was actually just thinking about it as you're kind of going through the Tam Sam Psalm slide, was that really on all these sins, they're partly they're all slides that we have to check the box on.
Yeah.
But it's, what are you actually trying to articulate in that slide? What is the core assumption or evidence that the audience or investors looking to understand? Is not one, yes, is there a fairly large market out there, but the way in which you're telling that through, your ICP, or what's your early adopter strategy to get into the market and then grow within it. That's really the evidence you're trying to learn from them presenting that slide, than it is that you have this large market. I'm going to then go to 50% of the market and then the 10%, right? It's more so of the underlying, what's the evidence or your methodology behind those things, versus you just having the numbers and checking the box. And I think that that's usually where we're seeing the quote unquote sin come from, is that I've checked the box because I'm told I'm supposed to have this thing, but I don't have any thought process on how I
why
actually
this is important.
right.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of where, I said laziness earlier. Maybe it's just a lack of knowledge around that currently in their startup process. But it was okay, I'm just this is a conservative number. I've seen other slides have this. So I'm going to have that as, our roadmap, financials, and it's a conservative number, right? Versus here's the methodology behind and where we're actually at in the process. And I think this ties to the difference between presentation and pitch, right? Was the pitch, it has this connotation of we need to share all the goodness and all the things, versus I'm presenting on where the business model is to date, and here's the evidence that I have in the methodology around the things that I don't know to be true yet, but this is what my my thought process and ultimately deriving those numbers are. And so I mean, one of the things Josh and I have tried to do with our startup challenge is even just changing the way in which we talk about that whole, and you've been one of our judges for that competition as well. And it's about doing the work and actually gaining the evidence. And so I love that this is kind of bubbling up in the discussion.
I agree with that. I mean, if not in the pitch, then definitely in the Q&A, there needs to be a clear articulation of where things are coming from and why they're saying that, and some, for want of a better term, some vulnerability in what's known versus what's, sort of assumed for the sake of this. And the founders that are pretty new to the process tend to be the ones that are the least vulnerable. And so everything becomes oh, I'm just going to be defensive for what I'm hearing and keep defending the number, rather than saying that actually, we don't know that. Here's how we're going to try to find out. But I'm not too concerned about it. It's figure outable because, right. And that, there's a whole logic there. So I think that that's really important. I think for me, that balance, to answer your question, Brooke, and we only have a couple minutes before we have to transition, is there's pitches are stories, and stories follow structure, and we've agreed, for whether for good or bad, we've agreed that this 10 slide, which is never really 10 slides, but this 10 slide structure is how we're choosing to tell that story, and it's what we're all used to. Which means if you break from that, you're doing yourself a disservice, because we don't know any longer how to hear the information you're trying to tell us. We're used to hearing it in this format, so you have to follow that format. But it's a story, which means that what we're hearing as you go through that story is what's behind it. And so if what I often see is a lack of connectivity between things like Tam Sam Sam and their early adopter and the customer segment and their differentiation, right? And so if you look at, just as here's an example that I think is probably less obvious, probably obvious to us, but like less obvious to maybe your average founder is like, if you look at your competitive analysis grid, you know, like the little XY with the quadrant all to yourself, which is, yay, it's great. But let's assume for a second that the founder hasn't made any mistakes and everything's meaningful. Like, let's just assume that. Then those two differentiators that have you drawing that quadrant all on your own is also is by definition how you've segmented the market, which means that the people who have those two qualities or desire those two things or whatever it is are fundamentally must be underserved by the competition, and therefore that must be showing up in what in your definition of your customer, your ICP, or in the obtainable market. Like, this is who we're going after because they're underserved, and that's why we're doing this. So that's just one example of like 3 different slides where the exact same message comes through, and I see more often than not like that competitive differentiation. They chose 2 ways in which they are different so that they do own the quadrant, but it's meaningless because you didn't like, why do they care about those 2 things above all else, and why are those 2 things going to be what cause you to win?
Right. And that's why I think that thinking through some of these storytelling elements around why is this, business differentiated, why is this a good company to invest in, is useful even at the earliest stages before you kind of have the metrics that might attract an institutional investor, because those inconsistencies will kind of be magnified over time, and it's easier and less expensive to iterate while you're young and more nimble, right? As opposed to later when you realize that like, hey, this actually, isn't competitively differentiated. So I think that's a great point. I did want to mention just a few other of these kind of tight ropes. I know that we don't have a ton of time, but I did want to mention them at a high level because I think that these are things that all founders deal with at one point or another in their journey. So I'm just going to list them.
Let's do the rapid fire round.
Okay. Sounds good. So I think that one of the biggest things I get, we're talking about pitching, is, hey, how much information do I share, right? You want to be easy to work with, yet you also want to be, you don't want to make missteps, right? And oversharing specifically with investors that may have competitive investments or that may have ties to somebody that you view as competitive, right? I personally think that if it's a generalist investor, you should share more than less. You should make the information easily available. So I always lean towards share a deck if you're doing a cold email, have a data room. You can have a 2-stage data room, but for the most part, if someone's asking you for something, and it's a pretty standard request, if you should think long and hard before saying no to an investor. I think that that's going to turn them off quite substantially, right? Because you want to be easy to work with down the road. However, like if you have reason to think that that's an overstep, articulate that to them, see how they respond, right? So how much information do you share? I always side on more than less. I think that for the most part, execution, is the hard part of this. It's not the idea itself, right? Of course, there's some exceptions there. If you think about negotiating terms, you want to be, I think that how hard you push when you're negotiating terms should correlate directly with how many other options you have, right? Like, where's the leverage in this? I think this is a pretty basic thing, right? But if you are, a pre-seed company and you really need cash, and you have one investor that's interested, I think you should be pretty accommodating, right? I think all that stuff will get made up in the end. I think that having the round close is much more important than getting, the exact valuation that you think you're worth at this stage. It's a dance to be had. I know I'm an investor, so forgive my bias, please. The other thing that I think about here is, especially when you're pitching, how much detail do you go into versus how general do you keep it, right? I would say for the most part, you should be able to explain your company with the level of information that would make sense to your spouse in a completely different field, right? Because I think that your generalist investor is not going to be that far off from that person for you, unless there's a industry specific fund, so that you're a biotech company and you're pitching to a medical investor. They're probably going to be specialized in that. That is fair to talk the industry talk. I think that will do you favors. But for the most part, it's much harder to keep it high level than it is to delve into industry jargon. I think you'll benefit from keeping it a little bit higher level, making sure that people understand it, and then letting them ask questions that guide into where their understanding, is lacking and they want more detail. And then the last one that I'll say is, like, as far as tightropes to walk, when you're an early stage company, you have limited resources. One of the biggest of those is your time. And you often have to make quick fixes to things that you would rather have a scalable solution for. So how are you balancing making decisions about where do you invest your time and resources when everything you'd love to do to the best of your ability, but you just reasonably can't? that one I don't have any answers for, but I think that that's one of the harder things. I know that founder mode kind of went viral recently, right? And that was all against making, scalable investments. That was about doing everything yourself, making sure that it's done well because you have to, and just grinding to make it grind. I think that answer is highly personal. I would just say that from an investor's perspective, I want to know where those things are, right? So if you're ever being asked questions about, hey, what's actually, automated? What's actually an AI-based solution? And what is for now somebody manually doing this in some low-cost country, right? It's okay to have that not be, fully built out. It's okay to not have a totally scalable solution. You just have to be honest about it. And it's okay to sell the vision of what this will look like when you get there, right? But that's my only ask. I know that it's a very hard question to answer, is where you invest your time and resources. I just want to know kind of where you're at today. And I think that the best founder investor relationships are the ones where you're leading with vulnerability, you're leading with trust, and letting that kind of build over time into a very healthy working relationship.
Right. Awesome. Thanks for the rapid fire. That's all. It's a gold. We
My
could
rant.
easily spend. Yeah. Well, I don't know. Rant requires more focus than that. You had a series of things, so maybe a lecture more than a rant. I don't know where the
That's
line
very kind.
is. But unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of our time here. But it would not be an episode of Zero to Traction if we did not leave you all with some frivolity to lighten up your week. Cameron, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So yesterday, Katie and I decided to drive up, perfect powder day, not really realizing that it was going to take us 3.5 hours to get up there just to take our dog through a walk in the snow. So we got up there 3.5 hours later, and then another 3.5 hours for about an hour long walk in the snow. So that's top of mind, as I spent a lot of time in the car. Obviously, great conversation. Rory enjoyed the snow, but that's top of mind, where it's like, I always think of like Tahoe's close, but it wasn't too close yesterday for sure. So that's top of mind for me and my frivolous thought for this episode.
So I have this like really strong like Pavlovian response to a drive to Tahoe, because when Deb and I had started dating, and we're married now, but like when we had started dating, we had been together, I don't know, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, something. We were still pretty early in the relationship. We decided to go to Tahoe, and so we left in the late evening, and it took us 12 and a half hours to get there. And there's a whole story behind like, how did you spend 12 and a half hours in the car? Why did you not turn around? That's a whole other story. But we survived it and we're married, I think, is like the key takeaway of that. But anytime like someone says they're driving to Tahoe, I have like heart palpitations now.
Oh, well, it's like you think of like dating, like you basically had probably a series of like 6 dates in that one car ride. So it accelerated your dating process to getting married.
We had a very similar story. It was 7.5 hours. We didn't even get to come home. We were stuck over there. All the hotels were selling out because they closed the path both ways. It was just a nightmare. But we're also married, so made it through. But now I'm very picky about when and where we drive up to Tahoe, because I just never want to experience that again.
I'm absolutely with you. So Brooke, what do you got for us? What's your frivolous
so
thought?
I went to go see Elf the other day, Elf the musical, which I didn't know that they made a musical, but they have it in downtown Sacramento. There's that theater in the round, which was interesting to see something that is a movie with no soundtrack put to music and then portrayed by a different cast of characters. A bit of an odd experience. But the thing that I've been wondering about is theater economics. Like, I wonder, does this troupe travel locally? And then, as you're Elf, right? So it's not like you can just go on tour for a year touring Elf to all these different theaters around. So are these people professionals who only do this, and do they only do it in December and only go to like 1 or 2 cities? Or is it just a short run and you pick up a new contract? Like, how long does a show have to be runnable in order to make it work for the actors?
So I don't have an answer to that specific question here, but I will say, as I did way back in the day, I did community theater, and that doesn't That doesn't surprise anybody who knows me, but like way back in the community theater. So a lot of times, so there's like different levels of community theater, but a lot of community theater, the actors are unpaid. And so like the economics don't have to really work out for that. And they'll have really short runs. Sometimes they'll have, a weekend or a couple of weekend runs of shows and then they'll be over. So like having a holiday edition doesn't necessarily change it. Whereas you contrast that with something like, I think Mrs. Doubtfire, which was another one of those musical like movies turned into musicals. That one was like, that's like a touring thing. So I don't know. I don't know how they make that work.
So maybe it was community theater, maybe it wasn't, but it was like Broadway, Sacramento. That's what I'm confused.
I don't know. Everything I know about like musical theater economics comes from the producers, which is probably not the most.
Sponsored by somebody too, so I think that also says a lot about the show. It was sponsored by a business.
Was it good?
It was good. It was, if you're not already a fan of the movie, I wouldn't spend the time because it just won't make sense, right? But a lot of the actors, it was funny to see somebody else other than Will Ferrell in that role. But he did a good job. Yeah, it was a good show.
Nice.
Awesome. Well, for my my frivolous thought, this is going to be like Josh is weird in ways that are unpredictable kind of thing. But there's a t-shirt that I've got my eye on. I know this is going to seem really weird. So it's made by a content creator who's like a big name on Jewish Twitter. And no, I am not Jewish. But I'm not on Twitter either. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes. But the t-shirt is a reference to Rabbi Lowe, who was a scholar and mystic in the 17th century who was kind of like associated with the myth of the golem. I don't know if you guys are familiar with. It's like he formed like there was an X-Files episode about it too. Like you form a person out of clay and then through magic it's animated and you can like exact revenge through this inanimate thing. Anyway, on its forehead is carved this or kind of inscribed the Hebrew word emet, which means truth. And then the legend from this guy is that you smudge out the aleph, which is the first character in the word, and so emet becomes met, and met means death, and that's how you kill the golem at the end of it. Anyway, so it's a t-shirt that has emet written on it with first the aleph sort of like rubbed out. And so that's it. That's the whole thing. And it's a t-shirt that for some reason really resonates with me because at the end of 2024, moving into 2025, I feel like we're at the age of the golem. I just feel like that's where we are. And this t-shirt is really speaking to me in a way that I really can't articulate.
Oh my gosh. That was very deep, very deep. I think we need an episode to process that one. So.
I haven't fully processed it myself. It's just something that like, I don't know. It resonates. I don't know.
Where do you buy a t-shirt like that?
So there's a content creator. Her name is Sophia. I'm forgetting her last name, but she goes by. This is going to get so much worse. So she goes by the handle Maimonides Nuts, which is Maimonides as in the 12th century rabbinic scholar, and nuts as in D's nuts, and that's what she goes by. And she's just funny on Jewish Twitter and Jewish Instagram and stuff like that, making a lot of these kinds of obscure references that if you're not Jewish, you won't get most of them. I'm not Jewish. I get a lot of them, but definitely not all of them. And some of them are like worth diving into because they're funny. Anyway, so part of her merch is what she calls the Get Low shirt for after, get Rabbi Low. And that's where you get a shirt like that.
That's so funny.
Yeah. Well, now that I've thoroughly humiliated myself, this is why I should really think of my frivolity in advance. I haven't learned my lesson yet, though. I know, that's true. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, as always, Cameron, for joining. And Brooke, thanks so much for hopping on. You are welcome anytime.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to be part of your friend group.
Yes, we need more.
Friends just get roped into stuff until they decide they're no longer friends, and then we have to like begin recruitment anew and go through it. But welcome to the circle. We're proud to have you in the circle here. As always, podcasts grow by word of mouth. So really appreciate it if you tell a friend about the show, or of course like, subscribe, follow. All the podcast players use different terminology now. That makes this fun. But do whatever the thing is, and then leave us a review, even if it's a bad one. We'll take all the reviews. Just leave us a review because the algorithm don't care. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you guys soon. Brooke, thanks again for joining us this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me. See you guys.
Thank you so much.